Very welcome back. My name is Jennifer Baker. For those of you who don't know me, I am a digital rights and tech policy journalist based here in Brussels. Also, I am a journalist. I come with some quite strong opinions of my own, although I probably won't be voicing too many of them today, as you can probably hear. I have a little bit of a sore throat. So fortunately, we have three very experienced speakers on this panel who are going to take all the pressure off me. So let me introduce to you, to my right, Peter Eberl, who is the Deputy Head of Unit for Cybersecurity and Digital Privacy Policy at the European Commission. Hello, Peter. Then we have Burcu, who is the Director of Digital Rights Programme at Public Citizen in the US. And last but not least, Ursula Pachl, Deputy Director General of BEUC, the European Consumer Rights Organisation. Let me ask you all then a very broad opening question, which is, why does this matter? I mean, the title of our panel is Nowhere to Hide, Privacy and Digital Rights in Amazon World. Why are we talking about this today? Why is this important? Ursula, give us your perspective.
Yes, good afternoon everybody, and thank you very much for having invited the Consumer Voice to this interesting event. It's very nice to be at a trade union event and to see what are maybe common themes and common concerns. When we discuss in particular about and what is a top concern for consumers, digital platforms and power in the digital economy, or in the data economy as we say in the meantime. So let me just be very clear, we did not a specific investigation or something into Amazon, but I think Amazon can be the perfect example for big platforms and big companies that are typical for our times, and I would like to use the example of Amazon here to give you some examples of what consumers are most concerned about. But I think Amazon is also a very good example because they have so many different products and services. They are foremost, of course, a marketplace for consumers where they sell their own products and where they offer space for traders to sell their products. So they are huge when it comes to e-commerce. And they also are very active in the IoT market, in particular also with their home assistant, and that leads us also to the topic of artificial intelligence that it uses for Alexa, for example, and the automated decision making processes. It has other IT devices like the Kindle, for example, and it is a media service provider with Prime Video and Prime Music, so many different topics. And that is what we are most worried about, which is the huge accumulation and aggregation of personal data that Amazon certainly has and has the capacity to develop even further. So this is a company that I think really knows what we all buy. If we buy on Amazon, and a large number of Europeans buy on Amazon, they know what we read, they know what music we listen to, they know who we are connected to, and probably they know, if you have one of these devices, they know what is going on in your home, and they know what conversations you have. And this, I would say, is very scary. And it means that this is not only about your privacy, but it's also the processes that are used by these big companies, of course, are also analyses of your data, and that means analyzing your behavior, analyzing what you are going to buy next, what you're going to do next, predicting what you're going to do, and manipulating who you are in the end. So this is all about power that they hold and that they are used, and I think we are only at the beginning, because algorithmic decision making and artificial intelligence will immensely help these processes, so we are only at the start. This is all about data and privacy and digital rights and autonomy, but I would not skip one, which is one concern, which is very much a consumer concern, is the increasing selling of dangerous products on Amazon, also on other marketplaces. I would also mention eBay, for example, but our members, you may know, national consumer organizations do a lot of testing, and they find increasingly dangerous products that come through third traders on these platforms, and where these platforms do not do enough at all to make sure that these products disappear. So we have a lot of cases, particularly our member in the UK, which discovered that even though the European safe gate system where dangerous products are alerted, even though platforms have been alerted, they wouldn't take the necessary steps to take these products down. And that is a real concern. And of course there is a lot of unfair commercial practices, like just recently for the Black Friday promotions, where there was clearly a very dynamic evolution of prices which had nothing to do with particular good offers for consumers on that very Friday, so misleading practices. Just to give you a short spectrum of the problems that we see with Amazon as an example of the big platforms. And I would definitely like to discuss what can we do about this, but that's maybe for the next one. Thank you.
We will definitely come on to that. Burcu, what is this? Is it the same perspective that you're seeing on your side of the Atlantic?
I think on our side of the Atlantic, the situation is worse than here. So reportedly, Amazon controls the first 50% of online sales, online e-commerce in the US. And there was a investigative journalist article like last year, Kashmir Hill, and she tried to block Amazon from her life, and her conclusion was it was impossible. Why? The reason is like Amazon is very dominant in online marketplace as an online marketplace in the US. So like it controls most of the online shopping activities. So when you need a toilet paper, you just grab your phone and order the toilet paper from the app. So that's what happens. But apart from that, we have Whole Foods in the US, like which we all shop, like especially in DC. If you are living in Washington DC, you buy your groceries from Whole Foods. But the main problem in Kashmir's like article was like, we know the Amazon is like a retailer, online marketplace. We know Whole Foods, but the problem was the back-end problem: Amazon Web Services, Amazon Cloud Services. I was in Berlin last week for the Internet Governance Forum, and everyone, like all the internet activists, had this like sticker on their laptops. There is no cloud; it's someone else's computer. So Amazon Cloud Services provide the infrastructure for the internet, and most of the websites we use today are relying on Amazon websites. So the cloud service for the most of the websites, even the biggest competitors of Amazon, are using the Amazon cloud services. So they are relying on the web services provided by Amazon. Her conclusion was that it was impossible to block Amazon from her daily life, because like when you visit a web page or use an application, you use the Amazon Web Services. So we really need to recognize the fact that like the backend, the infrastructure, we rely on Amazon, and that provides huge like power for Amazon. It's not only what Amazon knows about what we buy, what we like. Amazon has so much data about us. But Amazon is also collecting data by storing that data in cloud services from its competitors. So the profiles that it constructed about us, like it's huge, and it has implications for everything. So most of the discussion nowadays, like when we talk about Amazon, focus on competition. But like we have a big fight going on in the US in terms of privacy. We are trying to get a comprehensive and meaningful federal privacy law. And it's interesting, every time I went to the Hill to discuss privacy issues, I always hear about Google, Facebook, but not Amazon. Amazon keeps very low profile in privacy discussions, but the issue is Amazon collects so much data, and there are no controls over how much data Amazon can collect about us, how they can process it, how long they can store it. So the privacy discussion is very relevant for these discussions, and thanks for inviting us and including the consumer movement into this discussion. Because when we talk about finding solutions for Amazon, we really need to address the privacy issue. And when I say privacy, I don't necessarily talk about privacy. I do talk about privacy, but I also talk about all the other things like accountability, transparency, the digital rights, data protection. So in the US, privacy became an umbrella term for us. And we've been using it for the regulation, like every kind of regulation that we want for big tech. But the starting point for us is the privacy regulation.
Okay, Peter, your opening thoughts.
Thank you. I think I will complement or connect to what Ursula and Burcu have said. I think I would start with the competition aspect. I think there's important element is that Amazon, and maybe just to say it's about Amazon because Amazon has integrated all these services, but could be any company of a similar size and of similar activities. So Amazon is a platform for many smaller businesses, and there we have a platform to business regulation which at least tries to make it easier for the smaller competitors which depend on Amazon's platform. I think this is an important aspect, let's say, moderating or mitigating market power to some extent. Coming to the security, to the privacy aspect, but I think there's not only privacy, but there's also a security aspect. So if you look at the cloud services, as you said, it's a huge player. I don't know whether it's 50% or 30%, but many services and many essential services depend on the cloud services. I think a very illustrative example is that many banks or financial institutions store the data on the clouds. And we have NIS directive, which is the Network and Information Systems Directive, which sets security requirements on essential facilities or critical infrastructures, including the financial sector. And there's also certain obligations on cloud computing services. But what we have seen is that the financial sector, for instance, has very strict requirements which are higher than those of for instance, cloud services. And there may be a gap, and that's for the time being, this is solved by contractual arrangements. But it's not only a privacy issue, but it's also a security issue. If cloud services, so if Amazon were to have small or low level of security, it would be attackable and vulnerable. That would have an impact on the whole society and economy in Europe and across the world. And I think therefore it's important that there are security obligations on the infrastructure of the cloud computing. There's also security aspects regarding the home devices like Alexa and other connected devices. And I think this is again beyond Amazon, that there may be high levels of security for critical infrastructures for cloud computing, but if then end users or consumers connect a very weak device, that is the weakest link, and then hacking and intrusion may happen through these devices. Therefore, one has to think also about possible security measures for Internet of Things devices. That brings me to the privacy aspects. I think Ursula mentioned before that some of these home assistants may know about what's going on in the household. I think this is an issue for which the currently privacy directive and the future regulation are relevant, because these devices are terminal equipment, which means that they can only store information about what's going on and extract information if it is necessary for a service requested or with the consent of the end user. I think certain services which you order via home assistants, that may be necessary. So if you say I want to book flights, but a kind of complete storing of information what's going on in the household, and that is not covered by any service contract. And for that, valid consent would be required. And I think that is an important aspect as well. And that's why it's important to have a privacy regulation very soon.
Well, we'll not hold our breath on the privacy regulation. As anyone who's been following it knows, it has been stalled, seriously stalled for quite some time. But let's stay with this question about consent and whether or not users know what they're getting into. Ursula, you touched a little bit on this, and you also said you want to address some of the solutions. I mean, a lot of responsibility we're hearing is put back onto the, I hesitate to call them consumers because I don't want to reduce us all to that, but to the individual, to the user. How do we tackle that?
I think that's a very, very important question. First of all, let me say that there is always a lot of talk about consumers who don't really care, who are happy to give away their data, and in particular if the services are for free, which they often are said to be, but of course we all know that in reality they are not for free because you're selling yourself. And there is increasing awareness. So what we know from the surveys that our member organizations do is that consumers increasingly understand that the services are not for free, that when they are online they always leave a trace, that they are offline and always with their phone, their location data are taken and used, etc., etc. But the point is that consumers don't really understand what is going on. They don't know what data are really collected, to what purposes they may be used, and they don't know who is behind and who these data are flowing to. And I think that it's very difficult for anybody, even for experts, to understand the whole machinery and the whole huge business behind all the data economy and the platform exploitation that happens, that consumers are subject to. So the whole ad tech industry, the advertising industry, etc., etc. I think these are big, big question marks. And we have started to understand a little bit how this whole ecosystem works and how users are exploited. So this leads to a situation where consumers are increasingly resigned. It's not, I think, that they don't care, it's that they don't understand, and they don't understand what they can do against it, and nobody can read the terms and conditions, and nobody can read the privacy policies that, despite the GDPR that we have in Europe now, are extremely complex and not understandable, and nobody has time to spend hours and days reading all these different policies of all these different devices and applications that we all use. So this is just, I think, a very unrealistic approach to say, well, consumers should inform themselves and they should take the necessary measures. On top of everything else, there is very often no choice. I mean, we know that many of these IT platforms, they just have a monopolistic or a near monopoly-like position. Amazon is the most popular. I don't know how many percent we have, but I would say easily nearly 80% in Europe on online purchases go through their platform. So there is not really a lot of choice for consumers, and so they end up with this resignation. And what I think is very important in this moment is, we would really need the privacy regulation that, as Peter described, has a real additional function, which is very important, particularly for your devices, that nobody should be able to access unless you allow that to be done. But we also need to see the GDPR in action, let me put it like that. It's a decisive period in Europe for now because we haven't seen the big enforcement decisions being taken. We ourselves, for example, as consumer organizations, we have coordinated an action against Google, against the fact that Google, in our opinion, unfairly and illegally traces your location in ways that we call dark patterns, so you don't really understand what is going on. You're told that you are in control. I don't know if you've come here with an airplane, but you may have seen the Google advertisements at the Brussels airport, which are doing what I would call giving you an illusion of control. We haven't been able yet to really track down these advertisements, which all say you can have full control of your data, etc., etc. But this can, I think, be easily identified as misleading advertising. So all these things are going on, and we haven't seen the big decisions on the GDPR, as I said. We are waiting for the Irish Data Protection Authority, who is in charge of many of these big IT companies based in Ireland, to take decisions. Our own complaint has been launched 1 year ago, and 1 year ago, that's a long time in terms of digital development, and nothing has happened. So we're waiting for the GDPR to strike, and we'll see how this is going to work.
Burcu, let me turn to you then. I think Ursula was touching on this idea of consent fatigue, which we all sort of suffer. But even if we did have the energy to go through it, is transparency always the answer? We hear an awful lot that transparency is the sunlight that will clean everything up. But it's so complex that people can't follow it. Is transparency enough?
it's a hard question because coming from the US, like we have no rights and we have no transparency. So, you know, we, from that side of the Atlantic, we look at you guys and like, you know, we are fighting for transparency. But is transparency enough? No. So we have like BEUC and Public Citizen and 75 other consumer organizations from the US and the EU. We have a dialogue which is called Transatlantic Consumer Dialogue. And we are publishing a report next week about the consumer experiences online, like with online platforms. So we compare the consumer experiences in the EU and the US. And it is very interesting. I can't necessarily share the results, but I can tell you it was like very, very frustrating for us to see, like, you know, because as I said, in the US, our starting point is we have no rights, we have no protections, so we are like, we somehow like learn to live with that. But like for our European colleagues, like they were like, yeah, we have the GDPR, yeah, but then you look at the, you know, experiences of the European and American consumers, they're not that different, you know, because the problem is the business model. Like that's the issue we really need to address. The current business model, current big tech business model, even the small tech business model is based on data mining. You know, they collect information, they collect data. Like you're a flashlight app, why do you need my location? But they still collect that data. So and then they sell that data if you're in the US, or they process that data. So what happens is, like, we have like GDPR, you have rights and protections, but you look at the applications and the web page, it's not necessarily incorporated. So unless we get to that point, privacy by design, privacy by default, it will be, it's very difficult to talk about, like, you know, consumers, like, having knowledge about, like, about the usage of their data, or consumers having the control, because they manipulate you into that. Like, I mean, we were discussing with our European colleagues, like, and we were like, yeah, at least in the US we know that, like, this happens, like, right? But it was a big shock for them, like what happens, like, behind, like the back end, you know, all these ad trackers and everything. So these companies, they claim that they comply with the GDPR, they put all these ads at the airport. I saw that and I took a photo, like, but they don't necessarily comply because their system is not designed for that, you know? They still see the privacy as a compliance issue instead of a design issue. They don't start with privacy. They comply with the privacy rules. And that creates problem, and that's an issue for us in the US, because most of the time the discussion is about innovation. Like, and there is this conception that innovation and privacy, they don't exist together. No, they do exist. But your starting point should be privacy by design and privacy by default.
Well, when you say this, you mentioned innovation. I'm sure Peter, like myself, has heard over and over again this phrase, don't stifle innovation, which, you know, my internal automatic translate reads as, just let us keep making money the way we've always wanted to make money, which isn't really innovative. It's just, you know, let us do what we want. I mean, you hear these arguments all the time. So how do you approach something like, say, platform liability?
Maybe before coming to platform liability, today is the first day of the new commission. And our new president, she gave a laudatio some weeks ago in Berlin there was a prize award to an author, an American author. She's the author of the Age of Surveillance Capitalism. And Mrs. von der Leyen, she quoted from the book, and she said we will want to have a third way, not the state surveillance like somewhere in the East, and not kind of market capitalism where the companies, I don't know, did you mention data hoover or the data mining, where everything is in the hands of private companies. So we want to have a third way, which is a human-centric way, words, and we should be considered as citizens and not as just the data points. I think that is a very strong and I think very useful statement. On platform liability, well, this is one of the issues to be discussed in the new Commission. There will be legislation, I think that has been announced by our President. One has to see it's a tricky issue because there's, on the one hand, I think the current liability rules, which have been inspired by the US situation, I think they have largely contributed to the internet as we know it today as an economic success, I guess, but may have also led to certain exaggerations which we see today. So I think it's regarding market power, but it's also regarding certain usage by users for purposes which are not necessarily what the inventors of the internet had in mind. And you may have seen what Tim Berners-Lee has published recently. So I think this is something we have to look at. I can't tell what will be the outcome. I don't even know.
Yeah, it's a bit of a tough question on your first day of the new commission, I suppose. What we've touched on, these sort of, if we talk about these big platforms, not just Amazon, but Amazon-like businesses, building a sort of data infrastructure or a data profile of individuals. I mean, I think we kind of agree that that creates, if you like, three threat landscapes. One, that they will be monetized and manipulated by large multinationals. Second, that data could be co-opted as a state apparatus surveillance. And then third, that it could be compromised by just malicious criminal hackers. Now, Peter, you've talked a bit about the NIS, but perhaps one of the ladies, would you like to sort of speculate a little bit more on one of the two other areas, sort of this idea that, well, we saw the headlines in the US recently, that Amazon's Ring home surveillance has a deal with 600 law enforcement agencies whereby they will pass on the information if asked. So it's not just about private surveillance. If you did this in someone's house, you'd be breaching all sorts of laws. You'd be breaching wiretap laws and so on if you just went and put that level of surveillance in someone's home without proper approval. So are we sleepwalking into a potential state surveillance system?
Let me say, first of all, for a consumer, the main issue is not so much the state surveillance, but obviously it's the commercial surveillance, and I think this is the main topic of Susanna Zuboff's book that you mentioned. I understand that the new president has quoted from, which I find very good sign actually. It's the issue of surveillance capitalism, so everything we do, everything we are, is being tracked and is being used to predict our behavior, to manipulate us. We are under 24 surveillance, and that's the issue. And then of course comes the additional fact that this surveillance of the commercial sector may well be used to trigger and to allow a state surveillance. And this is, I think, linked to another issue, which is that many of our governments, of our agencies, of our public services, they in the future even more than now will depend on the technologies and on the software and everything that these big companies will offer, and also on the data that these companies will offer. So there's, I would say, a very scary scenario that you can draw from all of this, and in particular when it comes to artificial intelligence and the programs that will be developed. I think that there will be only very few companies who will really be on the top of these developments, and they will have the power, and they will sell also to the public service providers these applications that they will be used. And we have seen, particularly in the US, a lot of examples already, be it in the field of law enforcement, be it in the field of social services, where discriminating software has been used by public services without them knowing at all how these algorithms function and how they have been programmed and what the results are going to be that they predict. So one of our demands, and Mrs. von der Leyen has been very outspoken on that, is that we want to have a legal framework for the use of automated or algorithmic decision making, and we want in particular transparency and accountability when it comes also to the role of public authorities that have to have access to understand and to be explained how these algorithms and how these decision-making tools function. So this is one of our demands. We also ask for information for users. They have to understand the basic features of these automated decision-making processes. And the GDPR, unfortunately, in our analysis, does not provide for enough protection. So we need to go one step beyond.
Are you seeing across Europe this sort of increasing demand by national governments or national law enforcement for backdoors in consumer devices, these sort of security loopholes?
I don't think we have seen a lot of examples in Europe. We have seen some issues about messenger services and these type of things. But I think the problem I see that under the motto of more efficiency and cost reductions, that more and more public services are pushed to use these automated decision-making tools, and this is the high promise. And of course, everybody wants to save money, and everybody wants to be technology equipped. And so this is certainly a real issue that we should monitor very closely.
Okay, your thoughts on this issue?
Okay, coming from the US, of course, the state surveillance it's an issue for us, and I have to say it has been received better than the private surveillance. Like when the NSA, like the Snowden leaks came out, like everyone in the US was obsessed with the state surveillance, and at that time we were trying to raise the corporate surveillance issue, and they were like, no, we need to focus on like what the US government does. So the issue is like it's same for the other companies like Google, Facebook, like Amazon, and other US companies or the tech companies. Like at the end of the day, these are companies, these are multinationals, and they care for their interests and profits. Like so, they are not like social responsible charities. Like, and why there is like a frustration about these companies sharing their data with the law enforcement, because they share it like with everyone. Like, you know, law enforcement is like I mean,
they generally ask the data brokers to pay for it.
Yeah. But with law enforcement, like it makes things easier for them so that they can keep their business model. Like we come back to the same point. It's a business model problem, and because there are no rules, regulations over like how much that data they collect, how they can use that data, whether they can share that data or they can sell that data, how they can process that data. Since there are no regulations, it's like wild west there. They can do whatever they want with the data. That's why like we are asking for like some rights, protections, regulations over data. That should be our starting point. And then we can talk about the government surveillance, because it's an issue and we don't want like government surveillance over the data that these companies hold. But it happens because they can do whatever they want with our data.
Maybe 2 or 3 reflections to add on what has been said. I think for law enforcement authorities, it's of course all the easier the more data is aggregated in one place. And I think this is also a consequence of the concentration. If companies like Google, Facebook, Amazon hold a large amount of data, the public authorities or the law enforcement authorities only need to go to those 3 and they get a high percentage of all data available. And maybe even the processed data, which the companies have processed for their own purposes, which may also be interesting for the law enforcement authorities. What you said about the Snowden effect, I think there is a difference, I think, between access by law enforcement authorities and by private companies, because law enforcement, usually they have access, or they should have access on the basis of legal basis and for specific purposes, and normally those purposes should be good ones. So I think if law enforcement authorities get access, and they should get access on the basis of law for legitimate purposes which are defined by the law, I think that is a legitimate request, but everything should be framed by the law and of course under control of judges. Then from the European perspective, there's one big issue with companies like Amazon, Google and Facebook, is that this data is stored abroad. It's like the American legislation, I think, calls it by an alien state, so foreign state, and then there is this, what we have seen, I think, in the Microsoft case, and I think also in the San Bernardino case, but there's a problem of conflicting legislations, and these companies are exposed to contradicting legislation. They have obligations under GDPR, under European laws, not to disclose data, and then they have obligations under US law to disclose it. And then they are torn between a rock and a hard place. And but from a European perspective, we should be aware that this data is traveling to the US, and then US authorities may have access. So, as a European, I would probably feel more comfortable with having European law enforcement authorities having access, because at least we know more or less the conditions, than having foreign states. And this may not only be US, but this may be other countries where this data is stored. It's not only stored in the US, but also around the world.
Well, that very specific point, I understand there's an e-evidence proposal underway in the Commission with the US, and obviously you have the European e-evidence proposal, but is there other plans for a similar system as the US?
I think I can confirm that there are negotiations going on. We have the US Cloud Act, which gives access to law enforcement authorities to direct access to the service providers. We have a similar, but of course European-style legislation in the Parliament and Council on the evidence. And now there are negotiations, the Council has got a mandate on negotiations between the US and the EU, but I can't comment on the subject.
Okay. Turning now to questions of redress. If something has gone wrong, whatever that may be, maybe you've had a decision that's been made based on an AI algorithm that is intransparent and you can't work out how that decision was made about you. Perhaps your data was wrongly shared with the law enforcement because they actually didn't have the rights and it was handed over. Where do you, Jenny, this is wrong balance, where do you see gaps in redress options for individuals? Ursula.
There's a lot of gaps, I'm afraid. But there is also some good news, and here we are behind the US, and that is collective redress, or if you want in the US terminology, class action. So, from the perspective of the consumer movement, I may tell you that we have been advocating and asking for a collective redress tool for Europe since more than 30 years. And it's only been last week that finally the Council of Ministers agreed to a proposal that was made by the Commission. In April 2018, the European Parliament had already approved that proposal more than 1 year ago. So we have made a huge step. I mean, this text, this legislative initiative is not yet adopted, but because the main problem was the Council of Ministers and the Member States, I think we have now an agreed text that is quite interesting for consumers and promises to become an important and effective instrument to go to court as a group represented by consumer organizations. So that is a huge gap that we have had for many, many years. We have seen it in the Volkswagen scandal, or should I say better, fraud, where US consumers have been compensated within 6 months after the scandal became known. And European consumers haven't seen anything yet. I mean, there's a few actions already underway in those countries where class action is possible, but for the majority of European consumers there hasn't been anything, and there will not be something in the future because it will be too late. But for the next occasion, I think we have collective redress, and let me say immediately on that, in the GDPR, we don't have collective redress. This is a myth and a false rumor that is constantly fueled. We have representative actions, meaning that, for example, a consumer organization and digital rights organization can go to a data protection authority and represent the interests of an individual data subject, or can represent, in very few cases, on an abstract level. But they cannot, under that legal basis, under GDPR, ask for compensation. So collective redress is really about compensation, and we think it has an important role to play in the data economy to get redress also if your personal data have been stolen, have been abused, have been taken away from you without your knowing, without you wanting that, etc., etc. So there is a huge opportunity in the future for consumers to defend themselves better. If I had to mention another gap, I would mention simply the fact that everything gets so complex and complicated. Speaking, for example, on connected devices and product liability, which is a huge topic. You may know that in Europe we have product liability legislation. If there is a harm due to a product and it's a defective product, then there is strict liability and you get compensated. It doesn't work so well in practice, but we think there has been a very good deterrent and a very good incentive for companies to try to ensure that their products are in order. But in a world of technical complexity, as a consumer, you cannot prove that there was causality between the product and the defective product and what happened to you. And so this is something which we're pushing very hard for the new Commission to really revise the Product Liability Directive and to make it easier for consumers to prove that there was a problem and actually to ask the company who uses the product to prove that there was no problem. So this is the so-called reversal of the burden of proof. There are other topics like GDPR. How long does it take to enforce something? I've given you the example of our Google location complaint that we launched in 7 countries. 1 year later, nothing has happened. So we need enforcement to speed up. Competition enforcement is very important because we have really some deterrent sanctions, and we could be much better in remedies, I think, to make the market function better. But again, the Google shopping case has taken 7 years. And still now, even, we don't really know if the remedies that were then finally imposed were. So there is a lot to do when it comes to redress, and there is a lot to do in the sense that increased liability for platforms in particular, but also for people who use artificial intelligence, for entities that use automated decision making, where there is a lot of legal uncertainty when it comes now to the question, if something goes wrong, what can I do as a consumer? We need legal certainty, and we need that to incentivize companies who use these services and products to really make sure that they comply with the law. And we don't have this situation for the time being. There is a lot of question marks, and that legal uncertainty leads to a lack of rights for consumers because there's nothing that is enforceable. Thank you.
Okay, very good. You're going to have to be a cheerleader for the US now with class action suits, which we didn't have here.
Yeah, but something interesting, as I mentioned, there's a big discussion going on at the US Congress now for about the federal privacy law, and there are some bills which were introduced, and few of those recent bills include private right of action, but they ban class action and collective redress for privacy. And we were quite surprised, and we asked the officers, what's the point of having private right of action, if we can't go for class action if there is no collective redress and it already exists in US law. And they told us that we adopted the GDPR style. And for such a long time, we've been hearing from our European allies that this is a problem. And every time I come to Brussels and meet with these guys and we discuss privacy, they're asking us about our experiences, about the collective redress. And now we have all these privacy bills which bans collective redress for privacy. I mean, this also shows the power of the tech lobbyists, especially their power at the US Congress, because they totally manipulated the discussion, and they've been telling to those offices that, hey, this is a better model. This is what Europeans adopted, but it doesn't work here, and it won't work in the US, and we've been opposing those proposals. But we'll see what's happened, because as Ursula mentioned, it is very important for consumers to have redress without proving harm, because the harm component is very hard to prove. We also need statutory damages. That's established statutory damages. It's very difficult. The enforcement becomes an issue. So we are fighting for all those issues private right of action, redress, collective redress without showing harm, and also statutory damages. Will we get them? It's a big question. We'll see.
Okay, so 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And nothing really surprises me when it comes to big tech lobbying. Here in Brussels, all the organisations that lobbied against GDPR are now lobbying on the privacy regulation, and the argument is that the GDPR is so awesome that we don't need the privacy regulation. And I think they think we have very short memories. Peter? Okay, I think that at this point we probably have about 10-15 minutes left. Have we questions from the floor? Anyone in the room? Anything to us? Yes, I see a hand over here. We get a microphone to you.
Thank you. Agnieszka Mruzak, I'm from Poland, union activist, and I work in the warehouse. There was a lot mentioned here about privacy of the consumers, of the clients, and about automatized decision making. But the same Amazon is doing to us, the warehouse workers. And in Poland, they do fire only basing on the automatized decision making for if you don't meet a target. So on the previous panel, there was a question about possible bridge buildings and coalitions. So my question is, if in your work, do you see any possible like bridge coalition where these two forces could, show the problem? Because what we are facing in daily basis and like during 10-hour shifts, it's full control of what we scan and what we hack and do. So yeah, this is my question about possible coalitions.
Yeah, really good question.
Yeah, because thank you very much for that question. It's an amazing question, and because it's very important to connect the dots. Like as consumer movement, we had been like fighting for privacy, and in the US they define it as consumer privacy. But all of us are consumers, and there is also privacy at workplace, which is workers' privacy, and which we really need to talk about, like because as workers, we are all workers, like we all have employers, right? So as workers, like as employees, we have no like privacy, like a very limited privacy at the workplace. And we know that the employers have been using, like there are lots of like technologies that nowadays like the employers have been relying. For example, they follow your like typing patterns to see like how much time you spend surfing on the internet, how much time you type. Like these are the issues we really need to address, but in order to address these issues, at least from the US perspective, we really need to build like, alliances for privacy. As I said, when I talk about privacy, I don't necessarily talk about only privacy, but also accountability, transparency, the digital rights, data protection, and we need like, workers, like the unions on our side. And I have to say, like, fighting for the privacy legislation in the US as a consumer organization, we are very much alone by ourselves. Like, we don't receive like that much of support from the environment movement or the unions. Like, but this is an issue for us, like, because at the end of the day, it's about how much data, how much data they store, how much data they collect, how they process, how they store. We need regulation, data governance rules around like how the companies use the data. And then we can also we also need to highlight the fact that like the workers' privacy or workplace privacy is an important issue, because with today's technology, we have like challenges and we really need to address those challenges.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult with this definition of consumers or users. I mean, I actually feel it should be just a question of human dignity rather than we're always used to whatever we can afford to spend.
Just to add to that, because I think there are many digital policies which I think there is a common interest, as Burcu just explained, but I would like to highlight in particular automated decision making, as you said yourself. So maybe just as a teaser, we have a position paper which is on our website, which is called AI Rights for Consumers, and it gives 7 rights. And I think instead of AI rights for consumers, you could very easily replace the word consumer by worker and could say AI rights for workers. It's all about discrimination, fairness, it's transparency, explainability. it's robust data, it's security and safety. So all these rights, you could just apply them to workers in exactly the same way in terms of the legitimacy that as a worker you need these rights when it comes to automated decision making. And the other point is just linked to what Jennifer said. I think if you look at the GDPR, it's about data subjects, and that is consumers, that is citizens, that is workers. And from the consumer perspective, maybe just to add that the way you behave online or offline as a consumer is very often the material that is used to influence you as a citizen. I don't need to mention Cambridge Analytica. It's all about how our election behavior is kind of influenced. And the same goes, of course, if you're a consumer and you're looking for a job, you become a job applicant, a worker, and the same data may be used to select you or not for a job interview. So it's all the same interest in the end, I think, that come together.
Absolutely, and I'm going to give a plug. I'm doing an event on Friday that is about algorithmic bias in recruitment. So if you want the details about, ask me afterwards. Have you any other questions here in the room for our panelists? Yes, go ahead.
Hi, this might be a question more in the US kind of political context, but you read or hear about this argument that sort of, if not Amazon, then it would be a company from China who would have even worse practices. How do you argue against that, or what's your response to that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. A couple of weeks ago, Mark Zuckerberg, he testified at the Congress, and most of the time, when he had a tough question, and he was like, but what about China? They're building their own model, and we really need to fight with China. And I also use China example all the time, like for instance, TikTok. It's a big concern in the US now, because I don't know how it is in Europe, but in the US, Gen Z, all the high school teenagers have been using TikTok. And most of the parents are concerned about that because it's a Chinese company and data flows to China. And then I asked them, think about Europeans, that's how they feel, because their data flows to the US and there are no rights, no protections. So China argument is really, really picking up now, and especially at the policy level. But the issue is again, it's the Chinese companies now, they can do whatever they want in the US because there are no regulations, So I think there will be a hearing next week at the Congress, and they invited the company which owns TikTok, and they want the company to testify about data usage, But the issue is there are no regulations. So it's very hard to make that argument. When there are no regulations, it doesn't matter it's Americans or it's Chinese or Europeans. At the end of the data, these are all companies, and they build their businesses on our data. So that's why, I say it again, we really need to change the business model. We need to challenge the business model, because unless the business model changes, we won't get anywhere. You can introduce rules like GDPR, but our own research proved that the companies don't implement GDPR. They seem to implement the GDPR, the front end, this cookie notices and everything, but at the back end, the EU consumers are also tracked as much as the US consumers.
Maybe on this point, I think there's one term which is used in the mission letters of our commissioner and also of the executive vice president. It's about the digital autonomy, digital sovereignty. And I think it's about, for instance, regarding the cloud computing, to build cloud capacity in Europe. And this is not protectionism, this is just giving the consumers and especially the business customers choice to have a possibility to have a cloud system which complies with GDPR and where the data remains in Europe. And I think this is also an invitation to the companies to advertise this compliance with European data protection standards, European consumer protection, European employment standards, to to become more attractive. For instance, regarding the cloud, I think in Germany there was some time ago an initiative, I don't know whether it worked, but at least I saw it, it was an email made in Germany. And I think it promised or committed that the emails would only run over providers in Europe, I think. But I think the same could be with the cloud, and I think companies are probably willing to pay a certain surplus for the protection of the data, because they can also attract customers who say, I don't want my data to go to China, to India, to the US. And therefore, I think it's also an invitation to the business community to use this as a kind of branding for data.
Yeah, Germany's come up with Gaia X plans, which we will see how successful they are or not to build a European cloud.
Think about the digital sovereignty thing. I was in Germany last week, like everyone was talking about digital sovereignty, but I have to say, be aware when you are talking about digital sovereignty, it's a concept invented by Chinese. 15 years ago, Chinese came up with the concept. And now we've been hearing, like everyone, talking about digital sovereignty, especially in the US and also in Germany, with a different definition. I hope that with a different definition. But like 15 years ago, Chinese invented the concept, and because they want to survey their people, like the Chinese model was not based on, like, it didn't have economic motivations. It was like all about the surveillance, and it turned out to be like an economic success. And I hear it from most of the countries in the global south, oh, we are digital sovereign, we own our data. But like, so what? Like, what is the solution? So that's why I told this last week in Germany, like, be aware, this is a Chinese concept, and we don't want Chinese model of like internet.
Well, we'll see if it works. It's not the first time it's been tried in Europe. It sort of comes around every 6 years or so and fails. Last question here.
Yeah, can you hear me? Right, good. All right, Phil Taylor from the University of Strathclyde in Scotland. And I just wanted to go back to the point that was raised by the sister from Poland working in the warehouse, and really to emphasise, I think this is a really important session that's opened my eyes. I think it'll open other people's eyes. It's not just a question of the coalition of interest between, if you like, consumers and workers. It's the fact that the very same platform that structures the consumer, the suppliers, through the fulfillment centre, through logistics, to the final customer, is the same system that monitors, measures, counts to the millimetre of a second and so on, individuals through what I understand to be is an invisible but constantly shifting bell curve of performance. So workers don't know anywhere where they stand. So the question about, and this really is important, the right to understand, or transparency at one level does not help, workers, because the rules, it's constantly shifting targets that people have got kind of no control over. Therefore, the question of really the platform, and it's what your thoughts on this, the platform to me represents, can I be crude because I'm Scottish, two cheeks of the same arse. The consumers get one cheek and the workers get the other cheek, but it's the same platform that's bringing the two together. So it's not necessarily a coalition of interest, there's a united interest in dealing with what you rightly say is the problem of the platform.
Okay, I don't think we'll explore that metaphor any further, but your thoughts, yes. I mean, this is like the shifting terms of service we see that consumers or users have no feedback on as well themselves. There are a lot of parallels.
I would definitely agree to your statement that transparency is not enough, because you will just not be able to understand and you will be thrown into transparency, which doesn't help at all. So I think what we ourselves is try to see where are the red lines. So what data, for example, should not be allowed to be used to feed into and to program certain algorithms that then take decisions when these data, for example, have nothing to do, or in the health services, for example. Where do you just not want to be dealing with a machine? Where do you want human intervention? Where should it be possible for a patient, for example, to demand that they deal with a doctor and not with a machine? And I could imagine that in the workers' areas you have similar areas where it should not be allowed that you have an automated decision-making process to which you are subjected. And if so, you would need a right to reject, and you would need a right to explanation so that you can understand what data have been used, what the process is about, and what your rights are if you do not agree. So these are all topics, again, that are in common with consumers.
Yeah, final thoughts now, because we're wrap up.
Just to follow up on what Ursula said, like, we have different visions, like, for technology. There is this, like, innovation vision, innovation-centric vision for technology, and then there is property-centric vision, like, oh, we own our data. And what we need is, like, a human-centric vision, like, for technology, not only for data, but also algorithms. Like, as I mentioned, there are certain fields that we don't want, like artificial intelligence or algorithms. Like, we discuss algorithms, we discuss bias, discrimination, but we should also need to discuss, do we really need facial recognition? Do we really need, like, our doors to recognize our faces, like, So the human-centric approach is the right approach. But coming back to today's issue about Amazon, I mean, this morning some people defined Amazon as a big giant, too big to fail. But I think we have a modern day David and Goliath story here. The Goliath is the Amazon, the giant, but usually the giants are not the ones, not what we think they are. Like, most of the time their strengths are their biggest weaknesses. So when we look at at Amazon, it's a Goliath, it's a giant, it's too big to fail, it's a data monopoly, its business is based on data. But in the meantime, data is the biggest weakness of Amazon. The data rules, data governance rules, privacy is a vulnerability for Amazon, and we really need to highlight that. That's why we need, like, we keep saying it, but we need rules, we need regulation, and we really need to change our approach, because our problem is the business model, and we need a human-centric approach, rights-based approach to that business model. Because unless that business model changes, we will be having these discussions over and over and again. So there will be rules, but they will find a way to not to implement the rules, or they will find a way to manipulate the lawmakers and enforcement agents, the courts. So we will get back there again. But if we push for the change of business model, I think we can get there, and we need to do it sooner better than later, because the time is running against us.
Time is running against us, Peter, so very briefly, your thoughts. I know Ursula von der Leyen wants an AI strategy or an AI proposal in 100 days. Can you give me something in 100 seconds?
Well, I think what Ursula said before is quite an important point, that we want to have a human-centric AI. I think there was I know there was a paper last spring on ethical guidelines, and I think that will be the basis around which we will build, and I'm sure there will be something after 100 days. I fully trust in my colleagues. But I'm sure that is not the end of the AI story. I think other things which will apply. I think an important point is, Ursula said before, GDPR is not sufficient to deal with AI, and I think that is fully true. I think consumer protection rules, existing consumer protection rules apply, contract rules apply, and I think that's an important element as well. So there's not only one AI law, but there's a multitude of laws and regulations which apply, and I think what makes sense is to start gradually, not killing AI with one big thing at the beginning, but I think to do what is obvious now, and that is, I'm sure the colleagues are working on that, and then gradually enhance. And I think what you said before on I think it was your question on innovation and rights. I think there is innovation possible, and innovation will be fostered if you have innovation which people trust in. And I think in order to make them trust, you need consumer protection and you need also privacy and security. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you all very much for your attention. I know we digital techie people often go off on various tangents, but hopefully we haven't done too much of that today. So please join me in thanking the panelists before I hand back over to Nick.